Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're just going to skip the usual agenda and dive right into a seriously sweeping chapter of American history. We're looking at the antebellum South, right between 1800 and 1860. We'll be digging into the massive economic engines of the time and, of course, the profound human realities of this era. Let's get right into it. When we look at the geographic spread of the era, the explosive westward expansion of the Cotton Kingdom was literally staggering. Imagine densely clustered black dots covering the landscape, where each single dot represents 1,000 bales of cotton. And that massive, insatiable demand, it violently drove the expansion of slavery. By the 1830s, this giant economic engine had pushed the institution deep into regions like Mississippi and Alabama, spreading like wildfire all the way from Maryland down to Texas. Now, when we think of the antebellum South, I think popular culture usually imagines this landscape where everyone lived on these massive, sprawling estates. But the data actually shows us a totally different reality, one of sheer, highly concentrated wealth. Get this. Only 1 in 30 white Southerners actually owned 20 or more slaves, which was the literal threshold you had to cross to officially qualify as a planter. So we're talking about a tiny, incredibly exclusive tier of society that held the vast majority of the economic power. So to really understand how this society functioned, we have to look at its rigid caste system. At the very top, you've got those planters we just talked about. They oversaw the broad operations and held immense wealth. Right below them were the plain white folk. These were typically poor farmers, and honestly, they were often illiterate and uneducated. Then, at the absolute bottom of the free social ladder were the poor whites or day laborers, often pejoratively called crackers or hillbillies who didn't even own land. The thing to remember here is that the massive economic engine of cotton created these steep, unyielding inequalities even among the free white population, totally suppressing wages and opportunities for anybody who wasn't part of that planter elite. Now, looking at the actual plantation structure itself, you had the master at the top overseeing the broad agricultural and financial operations, while the mistress managed the extensive domestic aspects of the estate. But, and this is absolutely crucial, the total foundation of this entire system was the enslaved population. They were the ones forced to perform the grueling, unrelenting physical labor out in the fields that actually kept the whole Cotton Kingdom running. And managing that forced labor involved some really complex psychological and physical layers day to day. Plantations were typically controlled by professional overseers. These were often ambitious young men looking to eventually get their own plantations, and they used this mix of calculated tact and, frankly, sheer brute force. Beneath them were the drivers. Now, these were enslaved individuals who were placed in trusted positions and given the authority to make sure the work actually got done. It was a highly calculated system. By dividing the enslaved population this way, it reduced collective conflict against the masters and ruthlessly cranked up overall production, even though, as you can imagine, it bred deep resentment among the enslaved. Behind all those economics are the stark, horrific human realities of plantation life. 3/4 of all enslaved individuals worked directly in the fields. Abuse was incredibly rampant, and that included widespread sexual assaults against enslaved women. And tragically, infant mortality was devastatingly high. I mean, a staggering 1/3 of all babies died within their first year of life. Yet, in total contrast to this horrific lived reality, white owners frequently came up with these self-serving justifications. They actually argued that they improved the lives of enslaved people, pointing to comparatively lower adult death rates than in other slave-holding regions in the Americas. It's just a profoundly somber and disturbing contradiction. But, in the face of such profound trauma, we also see this incredible testament to human resilience. And that's the concept of fictive kin. Because families were so frequently and just ruthlessly split apart through slave sales, enslaved people developed deep kinship networks. They used honorary titles for non-blood relatives to rebuild what was lost. These newly forged families were a vital survival mechanism. It allowed for a real immersion into a shared Black culture, acting as this crucial emotional and cultural shield against total dehumanization. It was a way of separating themselves as much as humanly possible from the overarching white influences dictating their lives. So, a crucial point here is understanding the suffocating legal framework that those in power designed to counter any kind of independence. We're talking about the slave codes. And these weren't just informal customs. They were sterile, codified laws strictly governing treatment specifically meant to deter runaways. They legally allowed for brutal beatings. On top of that, they strictly prevented enslaved people from gathering in groups, from learning to read or write, or even just being out after dark. The whole idea was to strip every single ounce of autonomy from enslaved individuals.
The sheer physical reality of those slave codes is incredibly hard to confront. The control of this population wasn't just legal or psychological, it was maintained through severe, legally sanctioned physical violence. It's a really grave reminder of the profound human costs that this entire economic system was built upon. Now, of course, this extreme suppression naturally bred resistance, and that resistance took a lot of different forms. When faced with demands for literally impossible labor, enslaved people frequently responded with strategic, quiet, and persistent sabotage. They would often control the actual pace of the forced labor by intentionally causing breakages or claiming that vital equipment was somehow lost. Basically, if they were pushed to work too long or way too fast, the tools of their labor would just mysteriously fail.
But resistance wasn't always quiet. In 1831, it exploded into open rebellion. Nat Turner was an educated, enslaved man who held a firm, totally uncompromising belief in his cause. He led a small group of lieutenants to spark a violent slave revolt that resulted in a horrific massacre in Virginia. And Turner showed absolutely no remorse before he and his followers were captured and executed. This calculated, violent revolt fundamentally terrified the South. It was a real turning point that permanently altered the national discourse on how to approach the institution of slavery.
Simultaneously, you had these highly organized networks of escape operating right under the authorities' noses, which brings us to the Underground Railroad. This was a secretive organization of abolitionists aiding runaway slaves, and it was incredibly structured. Enslaved people would flee from safe house to safe house, which they called stations, led by guides known as conductors. The most successful individual in this entire network was Harriet Tubman. She was actually a runaway herself who incredibly returned to the South 19 separate times. She successfully rescued over 300 passengers without ever losing a single soul. Just amazing. As all these national tensions boiled over, the political system became deeply entrenched. The two major political parties of the era, the Whigs and the Democrats, represented very different demographics. The Whigs were mostly affiliated with lawyers, editors, merchants, and rich planters who really wanted to develop strong economic bridges and political ties. The Democrats, on the flip side, were affiliated with middling and lower-class farmers who basically wanted as little federal interference as possible. Yet, here's the kicker. Both parties structurally committed to the protection of Southern slavery, despite having drastically different demographics and political methods. So when we follow this historical arc, the trajectory becomes pretty clear. In the 1830s, we see the rapid geographic and economic expansion of slavery all the way from Maryland to Texas. Then by 1831, militant resistance peaks with Nat Turner's massive revolt. Finally, decades of unyielding political entrenchment and escalating conflict ultimately culminate in a systemic collapse. It finally ends in 1865 when the 13th Amendment is ratified, officially abolishing slavery in the United States. Which brings us to the end of our explainer today, but I want to leave you with this final essential question to really chew on. How did the massive economic and social fractures built into the antebellum South between 1800 and 1860 continue to impact the nation long after 1865? The Cotton Kingdom fell, sure, but its deeply rooted hierarchies and the profound traumas it inflicted left a really complicated legacy, one that the nation would grapple with for generations to come. Thanks so much for learning with me today, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.